A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. So Daniel sent us this one, and I want to read it because it's worth hearing in full. He writes, I'm reading the news reaction to the ceasefire announcement. I've read the transcript of Netanyahu's remarks and Yair Lapid's response. The reporting, even from pro-Israel sources, lays bare people's frustration with the mixed messages. We were told that Israel was going to war to finally eliminate the threat of a nuclear Iran. Netanyahu, in his usual boastful style, claims that this has been achieved. But last night, my wife and I spent the night running back and forth to a bomb shelter. Last July, Netanyahu said the same thing. We sensed it was a false ceasefire. It turned out to be merely a pause for air. I struggle to put my finger on why I find the whole thing so demoralizing. I'm no different than millions of other Israelis who've spent the last 6 weeks since the start of the war living in a hazy reality punctuated by rocket sirens and explosions. Normal life has been almost non-existent. Usually, when you read in the news, even when it happens in your own country, it feels abstract. But something about this war makes it feel more than that. It feels like we've run a marathon, and the government can't even be bothered to tell us the real story. As a Jewish Zionist, I am aware of the privilege that it is to live in a Jewish state, and of the enormous technical ingenuity and bravery that was required to fend off what would otherwise have been slaughter. Israel's air defenses, while not hermetic, undoubtedly saved countless lives, so I feel cheeky in a way for asking for more. If a government is effective in defense of its population, but refuses to meaningfully engage with them, is it really a democracy? Government by the people seems to imply that their elected representatives will be accountable to the people. Even if our leaders are successful and our military is competent, a lack of open communication makes it feel like we're paying taxes to an unaccountable monarchy rather than a democracy. Do governments prosecuting war in the modern information-dense environment always revert to a kind of empty, boastful secrecy? Or does Lapid have a point? We, the population, can demand better from our leadership. That's Daniel, writing from Jerusalem, where he and Hannah spent last night in a bomb shelter. And I want to just sit with that for a second before we dive in.
I'm Herman Poppleberry, and yeah, that prompt hit differently. Because Daniel isn't asking an abstract political science question, he's asking it from inside the experience. 6 weeks of Operation Roaring Lion, and the morning after a ceasefire announcement, he's still running to a shelter.
Which is the central contradiction right there. Netanyahu goes on television on April 8th and says, and I'm quoting directly here, Iran no longer poses a nuclear, missile, and terror threat to America, Israel, Iran's Arab neighbors, and the world. And Daniel's response to that statement is to dodge rockets. Those two things cannot both be true simultaneously, and yet somehow they are.
Well, they can both be true, and that's actually what makes this so complicated and so frustrating. Netanyahu's statement technically applies to Iran. The ceasefire applies to Iran. But in the same address, he explicitly said the ceasefire does not include Hezbollah. So the rockets coming from the north? Still coming. The shelters in central Israel? Still necessary. He announced a victory over one front while leaving the other front explicitly unresolved, and then packaged the whole thing as the elimination of the threat.
So it's not even that he was lying necessarily. It's that the framing was designed to create an impression that the operational facts don't support, which is, a very sophisticated form of misleading people.
And this is where the cognitive science gets interesting, because there's a specific mechanism at work here. When you're under sustained stress, the brain starts to operate on pattern recognition rather than careful analysis. After 6 weeks of sirens and explosions, people are not parsing the fine print of a ceasefire announcement. They're hearing victory and eliminated the threat, and their nervous systems are desperately trying to believe it. When the next siren goes off 12 hours later, the psychological crash is worse than if there had been no announcement at all. You've primed people for relief and then yanked it away.
The finish line that keeps moving. That's exactly what Daniel described. The marathon metaphor is doing a lot of work in his prompt, and I think it's accurate. By the way, today's episode is being written by Claude Sonnet 4.6, which feels appropriately meta given that we're talking about the gap between what's being communicated and what's actually happening on the ground.
Ha! Fair point. So let's talk about the structural reasons this gap exists, because I don't want to just treat this as Netanyahu being uniquely bad at communication. There's a systems problem here that goes deeper than any individual leader.
Right, because Daniel himself acknowledges this. He says he feels cheeky for asking for more, given what the military has actually achieved. Iron Dome and the layered air defense systems intercepted roughly 90% of the rockets Iran fired, over 370 missiles, and hundreds of drones, and the Israeli death toll in the 6 weeks of Operation Roaring Lion was 23 people. That is an extraordinary technical achievement.
It is. And that 90% figure is the one that gets cited constantly in official communications. But here's what that statistic doesn't capture: the psychological cost of being in the 10% blast radius. Or more precisely, the psychological cost of not knowing which 10% you're going to be in. Every siren is a potential membership in that 10%. You can run the math and feel genuinely safe on a population level while simultaneously experiencing genuine terror on an individual level. Those two things coexist, and official messaging almost never acknowledges that coexistence.
So, the information asymmetry isn't just about operational security. It's also about the government presenting aggregate statistics as if they address individual experience. 90% interception rate is true and also completely irrelevant to Hannah and Daniel's experience of last night.
That's the first layer of the asymmetry. The second layer is the one that's more politically motivated and harder to justify. Governments in wartime have legitimate reasons to withhold operational details. You don't want to tell the enemy which defense systems failed, where the gaps are, what the reload times are. That's real. But there's a separate category of information that gets classified under operational security that is actually political cover. The distinction between those two categories is almost never made explicit, and citizens have no way of knowing which category any given piece of withheld information falls into.
Which is the thing that turns secrecy from a necessity into a kind of governance strategy. And I think this is what Daniel's actually pointing at when he uses the word monarchy. It's not that he thinks Netanyahu is a king. It's that the relationship between the government and the citizen has started to feel like a relationship where information flows in one direction, upward, and decisions flow in the other direction, downward, with no accountability mechanism in between.
The social contract of democracy, at its most basic, is that citizens delegate authority to representatives in exchange for accountability. During wartime, that accountability is almost universally deferred. And there are legitimate reasons for that deferral. You cannot run a military operation by committee. You cannot telegraph your next strike to the enemy because public opinion demanded a press conference. But the deferral of accountability during conflict has a tendency to become permanent. The habits of secrecy that develop during wartime don't automatically dissolve when the shooting stops. And in a conflict like this one, where the ceasefire explicitly doesn't include all parties, there's no clear point at which accountability resumes.
Let me push on the Netanyahu, specifically angle here, because I think it matters. Daniel mentions the July 2025 ceasefire, which was widely described at the time as a false ceasefire, a minefield masquerading as a truce. That one also came with victory rhetoric. That one also turned out to be a pause rather than a resolution. So there's a pattern here, and patterns are different from individual decisions. A pattern suggests that the misleading framing is the strategy, not an incidental communication failure.
That's a fair characterization, and Lapid's response on April 8th makes exactly this argument. He called it an unprecedented political disaster, and his specific claim is that the nuclear program was not destroyed, that the ballistic threat remains, and that the Iranian regime actually emerged from this stronger in some ways because they survived a massive Israeli-American operation and are still standing. Now, I don't know how to fully evaluate that claim from the outside, but the fact that a credible opposition leader is making it, and that the facts on the ground at least partially support it, creates a legitimate question about whether the victory narrative is accurate, or whether it's a post-hoc justification framework.
And the IDI survey data from March is interesting here. 81% support for the operation. That's high. But the same survey showed a growing divide over whether the war's duration was being driven by genuine security needs or by political survival calculations. So the public isn't naive. They support the war, and they're suspicious of the motivation simultaneously. That's a sophisticated public position, and it's getting treated with a communication strategy that assumes people just want to hear we won.
Which is condescending, and I think that's part of what Daniel is feeling. The demoralization isn't just about the gap between the announcement and the reality. It's about the implicit message in that gap, which is, we don't think you can handle the real story, so we'll give you the victory version and manage the rest. That's not how you treat citizens in a democracy. That's how you manage subjects.
Let's talk about why this feels more acute now than it would have felt in, say, a previous generation of conflict. Because I think the information environment is doing something specific here that's worth unpacking.
The Gulf War in 1991 is the comparison that comes up most often in this context, and it's instructive. The U.S. military ran the most media-managed conflict in American history up to that point. Embedded journalists, carefully curated footage, the famous smart bomb videos that made precision strikes look like video games. Public support was high, the communication strategy was dominant, and there was very little competing information. The gap between official narrative and operational reality existed, but citizens had almost no access to alternative data streams that would reveal it.
And now every person in Jerusalem has a smartphone, a Telegram channel, a network of family members in the north who are texting them real time about what's happening. The official narrative has to compete with 1,000 parallel information streams, most of which are more granular and more personal than anything the government is saying.
This is the core of what makes the communication gap feel uniquely demoralizing in the current environment. It's not just that the gap exists, it's that the gap is visible in real time. Daniel can watch Netanyahu's victory speech and simultaneously receive a message from someone in Haifa describing a siren that went off 30 minutes ago. The dissonance isn't something he has to piece together over days or weeks. It's simultaneous and immediate.
And there's a specific dynamic that social media creates here that I think is underappreciated. Official communications are optimized for broadcast. They're designed to reach the maximum number of people with a single coherent message. But the information ecosystem that actually shapes how people feel is optimized for resonance. A video of someone's grandmother running to a shelter in her pajamas will be shared 100,000 times, not because it's strategically important, but because it's emotionally true. And emotionally true is beating officially accurate in this environment every single time.
Which means governments that continue to operate with a broadcast communication strategy in a resonance-based information environment are not just failing to communicate effectively, they're actively creating the conditions for distrust. Because every time official messaging diverges from what the resonance network is showing, it's not just a communication miss. It's evidence in the citizen's mind that the government is managing them.
I want to bring in the Trump dimension here, because Daniel doesn't mention it directly, but it's very much part of the context. The April 8th ceasefire was reportedly brokered by Pakistan and heavily influenced by the US. There were reports that the White House used what were described as threats to annihilate Iranian civilization to force an 11th-hour deal, which means Israeli citizens are looking at this ceasefire and processing the fact that their safety was, at some level, a bargaining chip in a negotiation between Netanyahu and an American administration that operates on its own logic.
That layer of unaccountability is genuinely novel. Previous Israeli conflicts, even ones heavily influenced by American policy, didn't have quite this texture of the Israeli population as spectators in a deal being struck between their government and an unpredictable external power. The democratic deficit isn't just internal to Israel. It's structural, in the sense that key decisions affecting Israeli lives are being made in a negotiation space that Israeli citizens have essentially no visibility into and no mechanism to influence.
Which brings us to the lapid question that Daniel poses at the end of his prompt. Can the population demand better? Is Lapid right that this is a democratic failure that citizens can actually address?
Here's where I want to be careful about separating two things that often get conflated. The first is the legitimate security argument for wartime information restriction. The second is the political argument for wartime information restriction. They're different, and the conflation is often deliberate.
Walk me through the distinction.
The legitimate security argument says we cannot tell you which specific air defense systems have gaps because that information helps the enemy target them. We cannot tell you the timeline of planned operations because that information compromises the operations. We cannot tell you the precise state of Iran's nuclear infrastructure post-strike because that assessment is still being made under active intelligence collection. These are real constraints and they have genuine costs if violated.
Okay, that's the real category. What's the political category?
The political category says, we cannot tell you that the nuclear program was degraded but not destroyed, because that undercuts the victory narrative. We cannot tell you that Lapid's assessment of the ballistic threat remaining is partially correct, because that creates political pressure on the government. We cannot tell you that the ceasefire was influenced by American pressure rather than Israeli strategic choice, because that makes us look like we're not fully in control of our own security decisions. None of those are security constraints. They're political constraints dressed up in the language of security.
And citizens can't distinguish between the two, because the government controls the classification of what falls into which category.
Which is why the demand for accountability has to be structural rather than rhetorical. Lapid standing up and calling this a political disaster is useful as opposition politics. But the actual mechanism that would close this gap is institutional. Independent parliamentary oversight of wartime communications, post-conflict declassification timelines that are legally binding rather than discretionary, metrics-based reporting requirements where the government commits in advance to specific, verifiable claims. We will achieve X. Rather than retrospective victory framing where the definition of success shifts to match whatever was actually achieved.
That last one is interesting because it's actually the most subversive of the three. If Netanyahu had said in February, the objective of Operation Roaring Lion is the complete destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity, and we will report publicly on verified progress toward that objective, then the April 8th ceasefire announcement would have had to be measured against that stated benchmark. Instead, the objective was framed vaguely enough that almost any outcome could be declared a victory.
This is a well-documented pattern in modern democratic warfare. The Gulf War's stated objective was the liberation of Kuwait, which was clear and verifiable. You could tell when it was achieved. The War on Terror's stated objective was the elimination of terrorism, which is not clear and not verifiable, which meant it could never be declared achieved and also never be declared failed. It's a governance strategy that preserves maximum flexibility for leadership at the cost of maximum accountability to citizens.
And Operation Roaring Lion falls somewhere in between. Eliminate the nuclear threat. Sounds specific, but isn't, because the nuclear threat can mean the infrastructure, the knowledge, the political will, the regime capability. Any of those can be selectively emphasized or de-emphasized depending on what you achieved.
The IDI survey data actually suggests Israelis understand this at some level. 81% support for the operation, but growing questions about motivation and leadership. That's a public that is simultaneously backing its military and maintaining healthy skepticism about its political leadership, which is exactly the right combination for a functioning democracy. The problem is that healthy skepticism requires information to work on, and the information environment is being managed to prevent that skepticism from becoming specific.
Let me bring up the comparative angle here, because I think it's genuinely illuminating. How does Israel's wartime communication approach compare to how other democracies have handled this? The US and the UK are the obvious comparisons.
The US approach has evolved significantly over the last 30 years. Post-Vietnam, the military developed a doctrine of proactive media management that peaked with the Gulf War. But post-Iraq, there was a significant shift toward what you could call narrative humility. partly forced by the fact that the WMD justification collapsed publicly and catastrophically. The Pentagon now has much more robust mechanisms for congressional oversight of wartime communications, and there are legally mandated reporting requirements to Congress on specific operational metrics. That doesn't mean the U.S. is transparent, but it means there are institutional friction points that force some level of accountability.
The UK has the Hutton inquiry model, which is interesting. When the intelligence justification for the Iraq War was disputed, there was a formal independent inquiry with public reporting. It didn't solve the problem. Blair's government had clearly misrepresented the intelligence, but the mechanism existed to force a public accounting after the fact.
Israel doesn't have an equivalent mechanism. The state controller can investigate, but wartime operational decisions are largely shielded from that kind of review. The Knesset's Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee gets classified briefings, but those briefings are not public, and the committee members are bound by security restrictions on what they can say. So the accountability loop that exists on paper essentially doesn't function in a way that produces public information during active conflict.
Which means Daniel's feeling of living under an unaccountable monarchy isn't just frustration. It's a reasonably accurate description of how the accountability architecture actually works.
And here's the second order effect that I think is the most important and the most underappreciated. Military effectiveness in the short term and democratic legitimacy in the long term are not the same thing, and they can actually trade off against each other. If you win a war while managing your population rather than engaging them, you may have achieved the immediate security objective while simultaneously degrading the civic trust that democratic institutions depend on.
Say more about that trade-off, because I think it's counterintuitive. Most people assume that winning builds legitimacy.
Winning builds legitimacy if the population understands what was won, why it was worth the cost, and whether the leadership that won it was operating in good faith. If any of those three conditions are absent, winning can actually erode legitimacy, because you've demonstrated that the government can achieve its objectives without being accountable to the people it governs. That's not a reassuring demonstration. That's a demonstration that accountability is optional.
And in Israel's specific case, where the security threats are genuinely existential and genuinely ongoing, the government has an almost unlimited supply of justifications for deferring accountability indefinitely. There's always another threat, always another operation, always another reason why now isn't the right time for a full accounting.
Which is why the demand for accountability can't be framed as, tell us everything. It has to be framed as, establish clear, verifiable objectives before the operation, report against those objectives in real time where security genuinely permits, and create binding post-conflict review mechanisms that have actual teeth. That's not naive idealism. That's what functioning democratic accountability looks like in wartime.
I want to come back to something Daniel said that I think deserves more attention. He describes the war as a hazy reality punctuated by explosions. Not a series of discrete events, but a permanent low-grade state of existence. And I think that description captures something important about how this conflict is different from previous ones in terms of civilian psychological experience.
The normalization of sustained threat is a specific psychological phenomenon that the research literature on civilian populations in conflict zones has documented pretty extensively. When threat is acute and time-limited, people can mobilize, endure, and recover. When threat is chronic and indefinite, the psychological mechanisms for coping are different and the damage is different. You're not managing fear. You're managing the exhaustion of permanent vigilance.
And government communication that keeps resetting the clock. We've won. The threat is eliminated. You can stand down. And then requires you to run to a shelter 12 hours later is actually more psychologically damaging than sustained honest communication about an ongoing threat. Because it's not just that you're still in danger. It's that you were told you weren't, and you believed it, and now you feel foolish for having believed it.
There's a clinical term for this pattern in trauma psychology, betrayal trauma. It's distinct from threat-based trauma. It's the damage that comes specifically from a trusted source providing false reassurance. And it erodes the capacity to trust future communications from that source, which creates a self-reinforcing cycle where official communications become less effective over time, precisely because they've been used for political reassurance rather than accurate information.
So the political short-term gain of the victory announcement is being purchased at the cost of long-term communication effectiveness. Every time Netanyahu says we've eliminated the threat and the sirens go off anyway, the next announcement he makes is less believed, requires more evidence, and is processed with more suspicion. The credibility of government communication is a finite resource, and it's being spent on political framing.
And this matters beyond Israel. The pattern Daniel is describing is not unique to Israeli governance or to Netanyahu specifically. It's a template that emerges in virtually every democracy that engages in sustained military conflict. The U.S. experienced it through Vietnam, through Iraq, through Afghanistan. The public support numbers tell a consistent story. High initial support, gradual erosion as the gap between official narrative and lived reality becomes impossible to ignore, collapse of trust that outlasts the conflict by decades.
Israel's 81% support number from March is high, but the trajectory matters more than the point-in-time figure. If the pattern holds, that number is going to erode, and the erosion is going to track the gap between what the government says and what people experience. The question is whether Israeli democratic institutions have the mechanisms to arrest that erosion before it does permanent damage.
Let's get practical, because Daniel's prompt ends with a real question: can the population demand better? What does that actually look like?
The first thing I'd say is that Daniel's framing of feeling cheeky for asking for more is worth interrogating directly. There's an implicit assumption that because the military has been effective, criticism of communication is somehow ungrateful or disloyal. That assumption is doing a lot of political work that benefits the government and disadvantages citizens. Military effectiveness and democratic accountability are not the same thing, and do not trade off against each other. You can be grateful for Iron Dome and simultaneously demand honest communication about what was and wasn't achieved.
The distinction between operational security and political messaging is the key analytical tool here. When you're evaluating an official claim, the first question to ask is, what category does this information fall into? If the government says, we cannot reveal the specific target struck in Iran because that compromises future operational planning, that's a plausible security claim. If the government says the nuclear threat has been eliminated without providing any verifiable evidence, that's a political claim being presented with the authority of a security claim. Citizens can demand evidence for the second category without compromising the first.
The specific ask that would make the biggest difference is pre-commitment to verifiable objectives. Before the next operation, before the next ceasefire, demand that your government state in specific and measurable terms what it is trying to achieve and what evidence will constitute proof of achievement. That's not a naive request. That's basic democratic accountability. And it's something opposition parties, civil society organizations, and journalists can push for, even during active conflict.
The media environment matters here too. The gap between official narrative and social media reality is actually a resource if it's used correctly. Independent journalists, civil society monitors, and international organizations are all producing information that can be used to hold official claims accountable. The IDI surveys that showed the growing public skepticism about leadership motivation, that's exactly the kind of independent accountability infrastructure that democracies need. Supporting and protecting those institutions is a concrete thing citizens can do.
And on the broader question of whether this communication pattern is inevitable in modern warfare, I don't think it is, but I think the incentive structure currently makes it the default. The short-term political benefit of victory framing is large and immediate. The long-term democratic cost of eroded trust is diffuse and delayed. Politicians respond to the incentive structure they're in. Changing the communication pattern requires changing the incentive structure, which means making the cost of misleading communication more immediate and more concrete.
Which is what Lapid is trying to do by calling this a political disaster immediately and publicly. Whether his specific assessment is correct or not, the act of forcing a public reckoning with the gap between the victory claim and the strategic reality is the right democratic response. It's what opposition parties are supposed to do. The question is whether it gains enough traction to actually change the calculation for the next operation.
There's an open question here that I want to leave with, because I don't think there's a clean answer. Can you maintain genuine operational security, the kind that actually protects soldiers' lives and mission effectiveness, while also maintaining meaningful democratic accountability? Or is there an irreducible tension there that means you're always trading one for the other?
My honest assessment is that the tension is real but smaller than governments claim. The vast majority of information that gets withheld under the banner of operational security is not actually operationally sensitive. It's politically sensitive. The small category of genuinely operationally sensitive information, specific targeting data, real-time intelligence assessments, ongoing collection methods, can be protected without compromising the broader accountability framework. The problem is that governments have every incentive to make that category as large as possible, and citizens have very little leverage to push back on the classification.
And emerging technologies are going to make this harder, not easier. Satellite imagery that used to be the exclusive domain of intelligence agencies is now commercially available. Social media creates real-time ground truth that competes with official assessments. AI-generated analysis can synthesize open-source information in ways that approximate classified intelligence assessments. The information environment is becoming more transparent whether governments want it to or not, and the choice is whether to adapt communication strategies to that reality, or to keep fighting a losing battle for narrative control.
Governments that adapt are going to find that honest communication in a high transparency environment is actually more credible and more politically durable than managed messaging. Governments that don't adapt are going to find that the gap between official narrative and observable reality keeps growing, and that the democratic trust they're spending on short-term victory framing is not renewable.
Daniel's question: is a government that defends you effectively but refuses to engage with you honestly really a democracy? I think the answer is, it's a democracy in structure but not in practice. The mechanisms exist, the elections happen, the oversight institutions are there, but the culture of communication has drifted towards something that treats citizens as subjects to be managed rather than principles to be served, and that drift is corrosive in ways that outlast any individual conflict.
What makes Daniel's prompt so compelling is that he's not asking this as an outside observer. He's asking it as someone who spent last night in a bomb shelter with his wife, who has lived through 6 weeks of this, who genuinely believes in the state and what it's trying to protect, and who still feels like the government is not being straight with him. That combination, loyalty and skepticism, gratitude and frustration, is exactly what a healthy democratic citizenry looks like. The question is whether the institutions respond to it.
The big open question going forward is whether the technologies that are making the information gap more visible, the satellite imagery, the social media, the real-time reporting, end up being net positive for democratic accountability or net negative. There's an optimistic case where radical transparency forces governments to adapt toward honesty because the alternative becomes untenable. There's a pessimistic case where the same technologies enable more sophisticated narrative management, where the gap between official story and reality becomes so normal that people stop expecting them to align. Which way that goes depends a lot on whether civil society institutions, the journalists, the independent researchers, the opposition politicians, have the resources and the protection to keep doing their work.
And on that note, a genuine thank you to Daniel for this one. It's the kind of prompt that starts as a personal observation and opens up into something much larger. The experience of one person running to a bomb shelter while a victory speech plays on television is a window into a set of questions about democracy, accountability, and trust that are genuinely unresolved and genuinely important.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the whole operation running. Big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the show. Genuinely couldn't do this without them. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you want to find us, head to myweirdprompts.com for the RSS feed and all the ways to subscribe. Until next time.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from slow